to PA Centered, a podcast designed to help listeners be a part of the solution to end sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. Each episode, we will take on a topic or current event to help spark conversation and break down barriers to building communities free from sexual violence.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PA Centered podcast hosted by the Pennsylvania Coalition to Advance Respect, or PCAR. My name is Cody Henry. I am the Communications and Policy Specialist at PCAR, and I will be your host for today's episode. Now, today's episode is trying something a little different. We've invited Suzanne Estrella, Commonwealth Victim Advocate at the Office of Victim Advocate, and Beth Docherty, a sexual assault survivor. Beth will be sharing her story with us, and then we will jump into some questions about the process of her speaking about what happened and how she found the strength to do so. Finally, we will jump over to Susan with the Office of Victim Advocate to get some background on preparing speakers like Beth with sharing their stories to the public. Now, this episode will discuss details of sexual assault. If that makes you uncomfortable, you may want to skip this episode. So let's begin. Beth, can you tell us a little bit about who you are outside of your experience as a survivor?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for asking. And thanks for the invitation to be on the podcast. It's really, an honor to be here with the two of you. So, while being a survivor has shaped who I am, it really doesn't define me. It's part of my story, but it's not the whole story. I haven't separated from my life. It kind of shows up in my work and what I care about and how I move through the world. But I'm also a chemist, a musician, a writer, and I'm a passionate advocate for trauma-informed care. And while the advocacy is personal, it also comes from a larger desire to change, create change in the world. And, I carry what I've been through with me, but it kind of walks alongside the other parts of who I am. And music is a huge part of my life. I've played in a symphony. I played flute in the symphony orchestra for like 30 some years. I sing and play guitar in a rock band. I, lead a contemporary group at my church. Music has always been a constant in my life. It's creative, collaborative, and grounding for me. And I'm also currently working on writing a memoir. And I recently had an essay accepted in the HuffPost about why trauma-informed care is so essential, and it should be out soon. And I serve as principal of the Trust Project. It's a research and outreach initiative that educates medical professionals and students on how trauma impacts health and well-being. And through this work, I lead workshops and trainings for organizations who are seeking to adopt a trauma-informed approach. And I lecture at universities, medical centers, conferences, public events across the country. And I'm an active member of HEAL PA, which is in their physical and behavioral action team. And it's an initiative working to implement trauma-informed practices across Pennsylvania. And then on a more personal note, my husband and I are about to celebrate our 26th wedding anniversary. And we share our love for the outdoors, spend as much time as we can camping and hiking and paddling across the United States, especially in our beautiful PA state parks. And about 12 years ago, we also discovered competitive ballroom dancing, which has brought us to an even closer connection, and just has brought this new dimension to our lives. So grateful to be here.
Okay, awesome. Well, happy soon-to-be anniversary then.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
Competitive ballroom dancing sounds very interesting.
It's been such a journey, an incredible journey.
All right. So what led to wanting to share your story publicly?
Well, I think it was in 2006, I was asked to be on, it was called a Panel of Hope at Pittsburgh Action Against Rape as part of their Survivors Information and Support series. And while I only shared just a small part of my story, including like a little bit of my healing journey, but even that small step turned out to be incredibly healing, for me, and powerful, and not just for me, but for the survivors in the room. And I remember feeling something shift at that point, while it was healing, it seemed to make a difference to others. So in that moment, I felt this kind of freedom that I wasn't used to. I realized that by speaking up, I was actually giving back. And I think it was the first time I truly understood that everything I had been through had meaning, and it wasn't all for nothing. And after speaking that small panel, I was invited to be the keynote at Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, and then also at PCAR. And those experiences really changed something in me, and it felt so freeing, like reclaiming part of my life because I had been almost just like forced to disconnect from it. So often survivors separate from their own bodies and from their emotions and even from other people to survive. But when I spoke out, it was kind of sounds strange, but I felt whole again, reconnected almost. And more than that, I realized I could use my voice to change the many harmful myths that still surround rape and child sexual abuse. And then I joined the Pennsylvania on crime Commission of Crime and Delinquency Spirit Speakers Bureau, which now is Resilient Voices, which I know Suzanne is in charge of. And our training was held over an entire weekend. And at the end, all of us, there were like 7 of us there, shared our stories to those in the room and to our family members who had attended with us. And that was so powerful. And it's really what keeps me speaking today. Like I think about that experience. I'm so thankful for that experience and thankful for Resilient Voices too.
Okay. Now I'm going to jump to Suzanne real quick. Can you tell us about Resilient Voices and what led to its creation?
Sure. Um, Thank you so much for having me today. Resilient Voices is a volunteer crime survivor speaker program that elevates crime survivor voices by providing opportunities to impact others through storytelling. The Office of Victim Advocate actually inherited the program from PCCD, as Beth mentioned, and that was several years before my time here. But we're happy to be able to facilitate the program and to see it grow and expand.
Okay, and Suzanne, why is storytelling such a powerful tool in the healing process for survivors?
I think it's important because when you just think about life in general and how important it is to feel like people see you and people understand you. So storytelling is that opportunity for the survivor to be seen and to be heard on their terms. And so I think that's why it's so impactful.
Okay, then. Yeah, I feel like storytelling's been around since humans began speaking almost. Like there has to be something special to it.
Right,
Absolutely.
right. Yeah.
All right, Beth, we're going to jump back to you. And so now we're going to open it up for you to share your story. You can take as much time as you want. If you need to pause, that's completely fine. Totally understand. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, we're going to go on mute. And yeah, it'll be completely up to you, okay?
Okay, thanks, Cody. I appreciate that.
No problem. The floor
Um,
is all yours.
okay, thanks. I was born with severely damaged and dislocated hips. My parents were told that I would never walk. I did walk, but with a severe limp, which led to this intense shame and self-consciousness about that. And because of my hips and that condition, I had to get x-rays every 6 months or annually up through my teens. And around age 10, an x-ray technician sexually abused me. And for almost 40 years, I never told a soul until the Larry Nassar trial, when I became triggered by those young gymnasts' testimonies. Because of what happened to me, it was so similar to their stories. And that's when I told my husband for the first time. That's the first person I told. Then in junior high school, a teacher began grooming me slowly over time by connecting with me through music, which had always been my lifeline. It's all I cared about. I dreamed of going to music school, so it was a really big deal when he showed an interest in me, and he nurtured that part of me. He encouraged my talent, he praised my dedication, and he never seemed to notice or acknowledge my limp, which I had always tried to hide. He used music to build trust, to isolate me, and to ultimately exploit me. And what began as a mentorship slowly unraveled into manipulation and eventually into sexual abuse and rape. And sometimes the rapes happen multiple times a day in bathrooms, practice rooms, closets, classrooms, even in my own home. He used threats and physical violence and his power the power of his authority. And he even befriended my father. And he obviously told me that nobody would believe me because he was a teacher and I was a student. And he basically just said whatever he had to say to keep me quiet. And it worked. I told no one. And this went on for over a year, daily rapes, violence, and secrets, until I told my Girl Scout leader, because I feared for my younger sister's safety because she had started in the same school and I was really worried for her safety around him. And when I went to my Girl Scout leader, I was lucky, that she believed me. She immediately got guidance from a rape crisis center. And then she helped me tell my parents, who also believed and supported me, which I'm lucky because that doesn't always happen. And eventually I told the police. And after that, 5 other girls had come forward because this teacher had molested them. And the state pressed charges. And we went to a jury trial, a criminal trial. And my teacher was found guilty and sentenced to 30 to 70 years in prison. And I was left to pick up the pieces of my life after that. And it affected me in so many ways, way more than we have time to talk about. But one way in which the abuse and the violence that I experienced was most damaging was my trust of healthcare professionals. I was absolutely terrified to see doctors, especially gynecologists after what I've been through. I avoided them until things became an emergency. And I couldn't imagine disclosing my abuse or getting undressed for an exam or trusting someone while I was feeling vulnerable. And for years, I was lucky and only going to doctors when absolutely necessary without any severe consequences, until I got an abscess on my spine and I tried to ignore the pain and the fevers that went on for weeks until I eventually lost feeling in both of my legs. And by the time I went to the hospital, I was septic and I almost died. And this was all as a result from avoiding, because of that fear and that afraid of being vulnerable. So eventually, after I did, obviously survive, and I have some permanent nerve damage, but I was able to get through that. I started working with a therapist about this, and over time, I healed. Even though I still have to work with myself, around going to new doctors and things like that. But as I began learning about trauma-informed healthcare, because in the hospital I learned a lot about what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. But I also, through therapy, discovered I wasn't alone in my fear. A lot of survivors have this fear about being vulnerable and going to doctors, and it can be really triggering, especially for people with PTSD. And that realization was actually the spark behind starting the Trust Project. And while that work continued, my work in healing and also the work of the Trust Project, another chapter of my story resurfaced. Eventually, my former teacher came up for parole, ex-teacher came up for parole, and it was a really difficult decision, but I chose to testify in his parole hearing. And I didn't know what the outcome would be. I had enormous support from the Office of the Victim Advocate. Thank you to all of you who helped. Thank you, Suzanne. And I also placed my trust in the parole board that they would make the right decision, whatever that was. And I took the opportunity to share how my rapist teacher's actions impacted nearly every part of my life, from living with PTSD to struggling with trust, navigating healthcare, facing challenges around having children, and so much more. He was denied parole twice. And, it's been a long journey, one marked by pain, but also by growth and healing. But I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be alive and to have found my voice, and now to be able to use it, to help others find theirs, hopefully. And if my story can even offer just a small sense of hope or validation or understanding to someone else, then speaking out has been worth it.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. I can't
Thank you.
imagine.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
So you had mentioned that your abuser took advantage or was done during your music lessons. And earlier when you introduced yourself, you had mentioned that you love music. How did you
Mhm.
reconcile those two things happening so that you could still contain that passion for something that you really liked?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I think music was such an integral part of me, and it's really how I coped with things. It's, how I just was able to feel. And I think I used it as a healing and maybe sometimes as an escape too. When he was doing things to me, I would go home and I would listen to music or I would play music, even though he was my band director and my music teacher. So playing the flute was really kind of attached to that in some way. I I still was able to use it to heal and to get through that. And it continued. I did not go to music school. That was one way where it did change things. But I've still managed to keep that in my life. I still use it as coping. I still use it as healing and connection and all those things. So yeah, I guess I'm fortunate in some ways because it could have poisoned that, but I didn't allow him to take. And I'm grateful that I still have my music.
Okay, okay. You had mentioned that you had first spoken out briefly at I think it was PAR, Pittsburgh's Action Against Rape.
Yeah, Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. Yes,
So what, and you didn't share like your full story until later. Could you
right.
ex how did you feel when you first shared like your full story?
Well, I mean, I was obviously nervous. I felt a vulnerability. It's never easy to share. I mean, it's gotten easier over the years, but especially the first time. But more than anything, after I felt empowered. For the first time, I wasn't holding it in or downplaying what happened to me. I was just standing in my truth. And it finally felt like I had a voice. It's interesting because, I spoke and, I testified in the criminal trial. And in my mind, I always thought that was an impact statement. And then until I spoke to the parole board, which wasn't that long ago, I realized that that wasn't an impact statement. That was testifying in his trial. So the impact statement was when I first had the chance to say, these are all the ways that it impacted me. And I think speaking, just like Suzanne said, about you being seen, being heard, knowing that you have a voice, it means it just gave me this moment of a sense of confidence that I hadn't felt before. And it reminded me, or maybe told me for the first time, that my story mattered.
Okay. And I'm sure it was nerve-wracking when you first did it. So what fears or hesitations did you have before speaking out, and how did you work through them?
Well, yeah, I had a lot of fears, but especially the first time. I worried about traumatizing people because, it's difficult to talk about sexual abuse and rape. And, I never want to harm someone else when I'm trying to help. I also worried about being blamed for being raped, which may sound, I don't know, maybe it's not, it doesn't make sense, but during the trial, especially, there was a lot of news coverage of this, and people were cruel. They were not kind. There was a lot of blame, and it really affected me, because during the trial I was only 16, and some of this happened, 14, 15 years old, and like there were people calling into radio stations saying, oh, these girls, they're lying or they caused this to happen. They're ruining this man. And it just devastated me for years. So when the first time I told or spoke out, I thought, oh, I wonder if this is going to happen again, which it didn't, thank goodness. Um, and it just, I had to work through that. And, I was also during, especially the first time, I was still heavily involved in my own healing process, which, I'm always healing. So those fears just felt very real. And I also worried that people wouldn't understand, or worse, that it wouldn't have the impact that I had hoped it would have. And there was also this added pressure of, I felt like if you share a piece of your story, that people would expect the whole story, and I wasn't ready to tell the whole story. I could not talk about like my difficulty with healthcare until more recently, maybe within the last 10 years or so. Um, and what helped with that was talking with my husband, who is just an amazing, I know I'm biased, but he's just an amazing, gentle man. And I'm fortunate that he was there for me, but also with a therapist, and that support grounded me. and reminded me that I didn't owe anyone my entire story, that I could share in a way that honored where I was in my healing process. And I still try to do that today, even though I can share more.
Okay. I find it interesting how you had a little bit of fear of inflicting some type of harm onto somebody hearing your story. That I feel like that's so innocent. I feel like most people wouldn't think that. And that says a lot about your character, I feel like. Not to get sappy, but
Yes.
that's really
Yeah, thank you.
powerful to say. Um,
Yeah, thanks.
have you noticed any changes in yourself emotionally, mentally, or spiritually since you started telling your story?
Absolutely. Yes. you know, it has changed me in profound ways. I feel more empowered. I feel more confident. Spiritually, I feel more connected to myself, to others, to God. And I think sharing my story created a space for meaning to emerge from something that once felt so chaotic and incomprehensible. And it's given me hope and a deeper trust in the strength of the human spirit, both mine and others. And that sense of connection shows up in my day-to-day life and in my advocacy too. And I really, whether I'm speaking to a group of healthcare providers or listening to a survivor share their own story, I carry this deep belief that healing is contagious. And when one person stands in their truth, it gives others permission to do the same, and that certainly keeps me going as well.
Okay. And how has sharing your story affected your relationships with yourself, with others, or with your sense of purpose?
I think for myself, it's given me just like a gentler voice, instead of that critical voice that's sometimes there. The shame that I once carried has loosened its grip, and in its place, there's this growing sense of self-trust and grace, which I was not used to, you know. And with others, my relationships have deepened. I've allowed myself to be more vulnerable, and that's created stronger connections. And, regarding my sense of purpose, it didn't just appear, it rose quietly and, from the silence that I once held and lived in every day. So, sharing my story has lit and really continues to light a path forward. And it's one line with meaning and connection, and with a steady and fierce belief that our voices can lead to change.
And you had mentioned that you were a little afraid of the responses you would get. So I kind of want to ask, what kind of responses have you received? Were you surprised by any of them?
Yes, I was surprised by many of them. They have been overwhelmingly positive and often deeply moving. When I've given keynotes, I have gotten standing ovations. Well, usually always get a standing ovation, and which honestly left me just stunned and humbled. I'd never expected that kind of public affirmation, especially after what I'd gone through as a teenager during the trial and everything. But what has impacted me even more are the quiet, personal disclosures and the amount of them as well. I've never spoken anywhere, no matter what setting, without at least two people coming up afterward to share their own stories with me. Some they're working through, some it was in the past, and they just wanted to share with me. One moment that really stuck with me is I had done a workshop at a child maltreatment conference, and after the workshop, a sane nurse, a sexual assault nurse examiner, just sat there silent. And eventually she told me that for the first time, she realized she'd been avoiding medical care because of her own history of sexual assault. And this is someone that is doing sexual assault exams every day. And it was for children as well. And that realization changed something in her. And so I felt really honored to be part of that. And another moment that I'll never forget is after had done a Take Back the Night speech, a young man approached me and told me that he had been sexually abusing someone for a long period of time. And he said he was in treatment and he was trying to take responsibility. But hearing my story was the first time that he understood the impact that what he had done, what that had on a survivor. And that conversation was heavy,
Yeah.
but it reminds me of why I speak out, because stories can reach people in ways that nothing else can. So it was a really profound moment for me.
Yeah, I definitely can't imagine how that must have been.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah,
definitely a
yeah,
surprise for that one. Didn't expect that.
absolutely. Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah.
Um, so I think you touched on this a little bit before, but has telling your story helped you reclaim any part of your power, identity, or voice?
Yeah. I mean, I've learned to speak my truth. Yeah, I think I might have said that even when others try to shape it. I once did a TV interview with an investigative reporter, and after one of the major abuse trials, I don't remember, it was like either Sandusky or Nassar, and he kept trying to lead me toward answers that would serve his story, and I didn't go along with it, and I stayed with what was true for me, not what someone else wanted to hear. And that moment really showed me how far I had come, because I was able to advocate for myself and say, no, this is not okay. Like, this is my story, not what you want me to say. And then just recently, regarding this podcast, Suzanne called, and she reminded me that I don't have to answer anything that I'm not comfortable with. And it was a powerful reminder for me that I still get to set the boundaries, and she was advocating for me as a survivor, and that support in knowing I have the right to choose just meant more than I can fully express. Thank you for that, Suzanne. I just really appreciated that moment. So thank you. But yeah, so those are just some of the ways that it has changed me.
Okay. Um, so what have you learned about yourself through the process of speaking out? I'm sure there has to be something there.
Oh yeah. I'm in a writing class right now with a group of amazing women writers, and one of them recently call me chingona, which is the Spanish word for badass. Hopefully, I can say badass on this podcast, but it made me laugh. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to go with that because I'm still standing. I'm strong. I'm steady. And I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe I've shown myself something. And this journey certainly has shown me that I can speak my truth with clarity and courage, and I've learned that I'm capable of healing and growing and holding space for both the pain that I have endured and the power of who I've become. And perhaps most importantly, I've learned to see myself with compassion, not just someone who's survived, but someone who continues to rise and continues to grow and continues to heal, which has been really important.
That's fantastic. And especially with you're writing your memoir, right? So I'm sure
Yes,
that
yeah,
writing
which has
class is
also been
coming in handy.
incredibly, yeah, it
Yeah,
is. It's incredibly healing. Writing has been way more than I realized it would be.
yeah. What would you say to another survivor who's thinking about sharing their story but is unsure or afraid?
Well, first of all, take your time. There is no rush. There's no right way. Your story belongs to you, as we've talked about. You get to decide when and how and whom you share it with. And start where it feels safe, even if it's just saying it out loud to yourself, because that there's power in that as well. And speaking can be empowering, but it's also vulnerable. And that's why self-care matters so much. And self-care can be even as something as simple as like planning something nice for yourself after you speak. I try to do that when I speak, because it can be emotionally exhausting, especially if it's one of the early times, the first times. But really, every time I've spoken, I need to do something nice for myself. Also, working with a therapist is so important. And I don't know if everybody has a therapist, but or at least someone you really trust, that someone who can help you feel grounded and supported, especially when difficult emotions come up, because sometimes they do. Sometimes you can't prepare for that. And then also know and maybe prepare for the fact that people will respond in different ways. Some may surprise you with compassion, and others may not know how to respond at all. And that doesn't define you. Those reactions don't define you. Your story still takes courage to tell it, and don't do it alone. Find a supportive community. Like Resilient Voices is a great example. A supportive community of people who know what you're going through. It makes all the difference to have that support. And remember that your voice is powerful. Not because it's loud or polished, but because it's yours. And, you know, when you're ready, your truth will find its way out, you know, whatever it looks like. There are different ways to be involved and to speak.
Thank you so much.
Or thank you.
So now we're going to jump to Suzanne. Beth had mentioned that you kind of always stayed in touch, like before, during, and after, especially after is what she touched on. So I kind of want to ask, how do you support survivors before, during, and after they share their stories? If you could touch on that a little bit more.
Sure. It's not always me personally, but we have staff members on site, and now we have even a victim expert speaker who is working as a consultant for us. And before anyone is doing a Resilient Voices engagement, we kind of call them beforehand to make sure they understand, you know, the platform, the audience is going to be, anything that they need, that they're ready and to share their story. We remind them that it's their story and that they should be centered in the process, that they have the right to say no to questions. They have the right to say, no, they don't want to receive questions, that they're just going to share a prepared statement, things of that nature. So we just try to remind them about those empowerment principles, make sure they're ready. And then after the event, we try to check back in, whether it's a phone call or an email, just to remind them about self-care, like how are you feeling after this? And that's being a listening ear. Sometimes it's just listening to what the speaker wants to say about how it made them feel or what they felt. And sometimes that's it, not providing any advice or anything, but just listening to what they have to say. And then sometimes it is that gentle reminder about some self-care and building some resiliency and moving forward.
Okay. And what safeguards or trauma-informed practices do you have in place to ensure survivors feel safe and empowered to not just share their story, but to kind of get it right in their heads before they can share it, if that makes sense?
Sure. So becoming a part of the program, we do a training. And Beth mentioned before, it's much shorter than it used to be and often is online now since COVID. But we do a training about speaking, public speaking, kind of just some of the basics around public speaking, and then trauma-informed principles, kind of what they are, and voice and choice, and what that means to a survivor speaker, being empowered to kind of direct how you are sharing your story and what that looks like and what that means, and then kind of actually some actual kind of like sentences to put that in place when you need to and what that looks like, and just making sure that they're comfortable with that. We talk about storytelling and what we hope to accomplish through storytelling and how impactful storytelling can be. And then we actually give them an opportunity to practice, where we'll set up prompts, a pretend audience, then they have a week to prepare something, then we'll come back again for a follow-up where they're actually then share a story and we provide feedback and things like that. And that kind of preparation is a way to be trauma informed and to be prepared. And we also let them know that you've got to be ready to often sometimes expect the unexpected. We cannot control how people are going to respond, what people think, but you do get to maintain control over who you are and your story.
Okay. Um, how do you help survivors navigate fears around judgment, backlash, or being re-traumatized?
Again, we try to provide as much information as we can as to how sometimes just because the nature of society and the way we sit, that can happen. We cannot control other people's response. We can share what we know about victim blaming and things of that nature so that the survivors feel a little bit more prepared. But we try to really keep the focus on the survivor. And like, if this doesn't fit for where you are in your healing journey, don't do it. You know, say no. Pick a different type of training, of speaking opportunity. For example, we have some survivors who are comfortable speaking inside state correctional facilities at impact of crime classes or at a victim awareness class. We have other survivors who don't want to step foot inside an institution, and we make sure that they do what works best for them. Like we will describe like what that feels like when you have to go into the institution, what the security check is like, that whole leaving your phone in the car, and we tell them everything. We have an advocate that would go with you the first time so that you can see. And if in the description the person says, hey, that is not for me, then we accept that and we move on and we help them to find other avenues where it does work for them. So we just try to always be victim centered and listen to what the victim's needs are and be supportive of those needs.
Okay. The next question, I'm not sure if you can answer, if you're allowed to answer. So if you can't, feel free to just say pass. I won't take it personally, but could you share an example of a moment where you saw a survivor deeply transformed through the storytelling process?
Yeah, I won't give like any specific names or anything, but I can say that we have a YouTube channel. OVA has a YouTube channel that has a lot of survivor stories on there. And some of those are times when we've been able to actually have like grant funding where we can pay survivor speakers to be a part of a training program or something like that. And in those times, we have seen people feel like this storytelling was so beneficial for them, where they see that feedback kind of from like a large audience of people in the profession. That seems to be really moving and impactful. So we did some work on childhood exploitation and trying to create awareness for parents and caregivers. And we used survivor stories through like a video project. And that was just so impactful. And survivors seemed to be really moved by the fact that they were able to participate in that, that people wanted to hear that, and that people felt that that was important enough for the people who are the professionals to know and understand, and that they were going to use that to move forward in providing better services for crime victims.
Okay. Could you actually send me the link of the YouTube channel and we can include it in the show notes if you want?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Okay, perfect. What do you wish more people understood about the courage it takes for a survivor to speak out?
I wish that people could really understand the people element. I think sometimes we can get so bombarded with bad news, bad actors, and now like real crime TV shows that we lose the empathy for the fact that these are real people. Like just because someone's story is told on a TV show, it's not a celebrity. These are real people. And for someone to expose what was often the worst moments of their life, trying to receive justice or for whatever benefit that they may perceive or whatever reason they were required to share that story. I don't think that we often recognize what a benefit that is to us, like to us as professionals, to us as community members, to be able to receive this truth so that we can be better people is invaluable. So I wish that people kind of understood that a little bit more, that this is for all of our benefit so that we can be better people, better brothers and sisters, better community members, more enlightened and aware of what's happening around us so that we can actually make changes to the way that we live together.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I want people to understand. That, I mean, and unfortunately, sometimes it's not until it is you or your family member that people kind of take that deep dive to kind of somewhat make it personal. And I think that that's hurting us and not helping us. So my hope would be that people would hear the story and look for, now, what is my personal responsibility now that I've heard this story, and understand in that framework.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I feel like when you see somebody on TV or on social media, it's easy to strip them of their humanity almost.
Yeah.
So I think remembering that they are a person is very impactful. Um, so in what ways do you work to amplify stories without sensationalizing or exploiting trauma?
I really try to be intentional about leaving that as the survivor's choice. Like I don't get up at events or anything and retell somebody else's story. I often go the extra mile, even if it's like, I heard somebody say something and I want to quote them, I will ask them. I have to speak at such and such. May I have your permission to quote when you said, and see what they say. So always making the survivor's choice. I mean, I have permission to tell my story, but I don't have like blanket permission just to retell everyone's story because they're a part of Resilient Voices. So we try to be very intentional about that. And I think that is a way to honor people and to respect the individuals that choose to participate in the program.
Okay. And so the next one, Beth experienced a little bit with the media. So maybe you could shed some light on it. How can people, especially those in the media or leadership, be more responsible and ethical when inviting survivors to share their stories?
And that one can be a bit of a challenge. I think that if the media could be honest about their purpose and what their goals are, that way up front, the survivor has the opportunity to decide whether or not they want to be a part of that. Because sometimes the survivors, and we have like a whole another section to our training workbook that we give people to read in case they decide, like beyond Resilient Voices, they want to be a part of media sharing and media storytelling. That's totally different, and what you need to look for and be ready for in that realm is quite a bit different. When you might tell the story one way, and then they're going to cut and slice, and when you see it, you might not even recognize it as what you said. So we do provide information so that survivors know that that's quite a bit different than being a part of Resilient Voices. So, but I think generally people are becoming much more informed about trauma and trauma-informed principles. So I think if people in the media can take that knowledge and just make sure that they're being honest with survivors, that they're actually listening to what the survivors are saying, that would be super helpful.
Okay. And then what's your vision for the future of survivor storytelling and the cultural change it can create?
I think that storytelling is a fabulous tool for culture change. And at this place that we are in our society, I think that we need it. We desperately need it. And like I said, I think it's almost, while social media is great, has done lots of positive things. In some ways, I think people have become a little desensitized to harms and wrongdoing. So that's kind of the tough thing that we're up against. For example, I'm always saying, like, how is it possible that people are not outraged about child porn? Like you hear statistics about, oh, this is $1 billion industry and this, that, but you seldom hear just out and out outrage. And to me, I feel like everybody should be outraged that this is something that happens. So I'm hoping that storytelling will help to create some of that outrage and to change the dynamics and the community structure, that we will have an intolerance for evil, that there's some things that are just not acceptable, and make that the norm. Like nobody should feel comfortable with this announcement that there's people are making billions of dollars off of child pornography. And I know that's just one harm, but because the dollar amount is always touted, it just means, yeah, there should be an outrage. Anytime somebody's making that statement, there should be community outrage about what are we going to do to stop this, because this should not be happening to children. So I'm hoping that storytelling will continue to be impactful in changing those dynamics as what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
Okay, that really brings it all for full circle from a previous question where you mentioned that speakers need to be seen as human. So I kind of see like you brought it all the way back home, and that was beautiful. So that is all of the questions we have. Suzanne, is there anything that you want to touch on before we stop? Anything that I never asked you that's just you're dying to say?
No, just want to give a big shout out to Beth. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story. It is super impactful. And even though this is not the first time I've heard it, it still just impacts me in such a positive way. And I think that is important for all survivors to understand how much as professionals we learn from survivor stories and how much it helps us to do our work even better. So we're all like so connected. And if we use that connectivity, I think we can continue to collaborate and do what needs to be done to create safer, caring communities where justice thrives.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for all that you do for survivors. I mean, and continuing resilient voices, it's such a powerful, like you said, way to heal and change the culture.
Thank you.
And Beth, is there anything that I didn't get a chance to ask you or anything that you want to leave a note on?
No, just I thank you for the invitation to be here, and I appreciated that.
Well, thank you both so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. This has been very rewarding to like sit here and listen and just be able to like sift through it a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So thank you all so much.
Any views or opinions expressed on PA Centered by staff or their guests are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of PCAR or PCAR's funders.